It's an unusual stick. As a matter of fact, it's a very old one. It was only 5 years old or something when it was cut, of course, but I know that it was cut more than 60 years ago. It's obviously not a walking stick. That would be extremely uncomfortable. And in any case, you can see that the wear on the stick is right down here. And up here, above that, somebody has put a series of notches on it, both sides. If you weren't born in the circumstances in which such a stick was needed, you'd find it difficult to think what its purpose might be. But it had a purpose, and it was exactly suited to it. It was what Dick Walker calls a thing of purpose. How are you going to do that job? I've got a thing of purpose. And I'm sure that the man who cut it went to great pains to get it. He probably watched it for 2 or 3 years growing in the copse. Copse. That's a country word. It's spelt 2 ways, C-O-P-S-E and C-O-P-P-I-C-E. In the older ordnance maps it appears the latter, so I think that's probably the older form, but it was always pronounced copse by anyone, that is, who was born anywhere near them. You will sometimes hear the word coppice spoken by some red brick forester, and if you look in the Oxford Dictionary and you find it disagrees with me about these 2 pronunciations, which you will find, then all you know is that the editors of the Oxford Dictionary were born a very long way from copses. We, on the other hand, all country people, when we were young, a long time ago, were surrounded by copses. They were very important. They provided an extraordinary number of the things that were needed for ordinary everyday life. So what is a copse? A copse is a wood in which the trees are planted, and they're hazels all over like this, about 12, 15 feet apart, and occasionally ash. And when they started to grow up again, they were cut down and they sprouted again from the bottom, growing in like fuzzy hedgehogs. And they were all over the countryside. A small holding would have 1/4 of an acre of copse. A farm would probably have 2 acres of copse. And even a man with hardly any ground at all, just a single field, would have a few of the hazels and the ashes in the hedge, cut down, stooled we called it, cut down to stools in order they grow up into the poles that were provided by the copses. Nowadays it's very hard to find any. In our district, just here and there may be a little bit of copse in good order. Most of it has gone to rack and ruin because the copses aren't worked as they used to be. Here's a bit of it. If you come in here with me, you will see a copse in good order. That is to say, the stools have grown on about 8 years. Those are the hazel stools with the hazel poles. And here and there, beyond that, you'll find ash. And the hazels were cut every 8 years so that you would, there's an ash, so you would get through the whole copse, cutting 1/8 of it a year in 8 years, and the ash probably went on a bit longer, up to about 10 years, because it was used for different purposes. And the flowers in the copse were all the very early ones, the early spring flowers that could bloom before the copse was in leaf, because once a copse is in leaf, it's a very dark, sometimes eerie place, and there would be no sunshine for flowers. So it's the early flowers normally that bloom in the copses, except the extraordinary thing is that when a copse is cut once every 8 years, then all sorts of other flowers appear when the later sunshine gets to the land for the first time in 8 years. Somehow or other they manage to keep themselves there intact, below ground, and keep themselves waiting for the time when the sunshine comes back again. Well, the sunshine is just coming back this year to this place again, because this used to be a big old copse on an estate planted under the big timber trees, and it was worked very thoroughly all the time. This year it's just been worked by one man, and you can see he's left rather a lot of waste about. There wouldn't be any waste about left when I was young, because every bit of it was used. Somebody would come along with a basket, for instance, and pick up these hazel shavings just to take them home for kindling for the fire. And they cut all the bean poles, and they cut all the bundles of pea sticks, and they cut all the bundles of wood, the faggots that were burnt in the old brick bread ovens and underneath the coppers. And they even made chicken coops from hazel rods, and also little ash rings which went down to the coast to go round the masts of sailing ships to hold the sails. Here he is, the man who's taken on to bring this copse back to life. In poor state when he got to it, rather rough stools, but he's going to go around it, and if he sticks at it for 8 years, which I'm sure he will, then this copse will be back in good order as it used to be. He's cutting these hazel poles with a billock, which is the standard tool of the woodman, and he's going to use them for the one product of the copses for which there is still a big market. He's going to use them for making wattle hurdles. And in order to do that, he's got to split these rods so they're flexible half rods. And he does that by a process which is fascinating. One of the skills of the woodman, you see, he puts that billock in like that, and then as he splits it, you will see in a minute, it'll go in a minute when he's trimmed the leaves, and he puts it in, he will rock it, because as the grain runs out one way, he'll rock the bill the other way and steer the grain the other way. Do you see that happening? You could even try this in a stick with a penknife yourself. It's called throwing. And that way he will make every one of those split right the way down, its full length, without the grain running out. Very satisfying thing when you can do it. And that is his raw material. And for this particular product, the wattle hurdle, he can work a much longer season because he can work it into the time when the rods are green and the sap's in them. Because for a bending job like this is a good idea. Most of the old copse work used to be done in the winter when the ground was hard frozen. And here's the wattle hurdle, or we never called them hurdles, we called them wattles. There weren't all that number of those made in the old days. They were used for keeping the wind off the ewes in the lambing pen at lambing time. But of course, classically they were used for house building, or rather hovel building, because this is the way the rather poor houses that were lived in by the people in the country from the Middle Ages on were built. They put the posts up, filled in between with wattles, and then they smothered them with clay. You'll know the Yeats poem, I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin built there of clay and wattles made. That's what he was doing. He was using these. And did you notice that trick there, the way he put a twist in the grain? If you aren't careful, when you try and bend that rod round at the end and bring it back the other way, it'll break. Once again, there's a forester's trick for that. Watch this one, the hole. This is a real different one. He turns it, and he opens the grain, and immediately it will turn right round without breaking and go back the other way. That's how the hurdle, wattle hurdle, comes into existence. But in my day, they made thousands of another sort of hurdle, the famous ash bar hurdle, the sheep hurdle, that you hardly see nowadays. But he can do it. I'm going to persuade him to do it. And this is the other skill, how to keep the bill sharp. One of the most important skills of all. Well, back to the mystery stick. Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's a ratting stick. And if you think that's an unusual object, I can tell you it's an essential tool in the life of a small boy in the country 60 years ago. You see, we had millions of rats because the corn was all in sacks and there were no concrete floors to the farm buildings. And we didn't have the modern, sophisticated and supposedly humane methods of getting rid of rats, like cyanide gas and poisons which destroy their blood corpuscles and drive them mad with thirst. We went after them with terriers and ferrets and sticks. And this was the orthodox ratting stick, and I'll tell you why. If that's a rat rushing across the barn, and you try and hit him with a straight stick, your chances of getting him a good whack are absolutely nil. Whereas this, as you can see now, is entirely adapted to the purpose. Plenty of margin, and that's why the wherefore it is in that place. And that's also, you can tell this is one of perfect shape and successful, because you can notice, as I pointed out before, that one day after a particularly successful rat expedition, somebody marked up his score on the side of it like the notches on the gun of a Western gunman. As you can see, I'm something of a specialist in sticks, brought up to them, and knowing exactly which to cut for which purpose. For instance, fagging sticks. That is a fagging hook. This is what we used for cutting the grass, the rough grass, and the brambles and the nettles, and did a better job with it once we knew how to sharpen it and use it properly than you can do with a modern machine that's sold from the garden centre. And if we were cutting grass, we had a fagging stick that shape, which just held the on a curve that would resist the hook. That's what the lengthsman used as he cleared his particular stretch of road. If, on the other hand, we were pulling out brambles and cutting those, then we would have a hooked stick like that. And that stick, of course, was very good also for blackberrying. We cut a lot of blackberrying sticks. I cut that particular one for my mother when she was a very old lady, because she very much liked to go blackberrying. One of the things I just remember, which are very interesting, are these. What sort of work does that suggest to you, that shape? Well, I'll show you. It's a bundle stick. Shades of Dick Whittington. If you were going to carry your tools, and they did carry them miles, sometimes weeks between jobs, you didn't want a straight stick down over your collarbone, or you had a bruise right on top of the bone, which was extremely uncomfortable. So you had a bundle stick that shape. And some of them were very, very splendid. Some of them actually had leather on them, and they carved them and so on. This is as good a bundle stick as I've ever seen. A beauty, that. And a man could carry heavy tools and a bottle of cider with that with perfect comfort. Perhaps the most famous stick of all, which every man carried in the days when life was less secure than it now is this. It was a fighting stick, a cudgel. You've seen pictures of Bill Sykes in Dickens carrying that. Well, in order to make it, you cut it from the root so you had a nice thick end. Then you bored a hole down in it, and you poured that full of lead, melted in an iron spoon, probably pinched from the church roof, incidentally, and you put a plug in. And that was the fighting stick, the cudgel. And in fact, in Wessex, in the Civil War, there was a bunch of young farmers' sons who tried their best by forming a resistance movement to keep the marauding troops of both sides off their fathers' farms, and they had nothing at all to try and do it with like this, and they called themselves the Clubmen, and they became quite famous. Here's another quiz. I used to be sent out to cut these very often by my mother in the days when we cooked still over the kitchen range. I wonder if you can guess what they are. They didn't last very long, so I was constantly being sent out to get them. They had to be a decent length in order to keep you away from the heat, and they had to be that shape. They were toasting forks. And now back to the woods. Now the woodman is dealing not in the thin hazel rods, but in the thicker ash poles from the ash stoves. But once again he's splitting, and he's splitting on the same principle. But these are too big to be split with a bill, so he's got a special tool. This tool is called a froe, F-O-R-E. And once again he rocks it either way, you see, according to which way the grain appears to go. Toing and froing, indeed. And thus he split the two ends, which were going to make one of the famous sheep hurdles of which I spoke. There would have been 20 men making sheep hurdles uninterruptedly in this place in the winter in the old days. Now there's just this one man making this one ash bar hurdle at our request, but doing it exactly the old way. Once he's put that much of a point on it, then he's got to hold it while he peels it. And this is another nice piece of forester skill. This arrangement of poles is called a brake. And they're so arranged that when you lift it up onto the back pole, it will hold it absolutely firm, just as firm as any vice against the pull. And there's his jig, by which I mean that they started every season by making a hurdle that satisfied them and then putting it up on 4 poles and using it as a workbench and as a jig for the other hurdles that came. And by the end of the winter there'd be huge piles of them alongside every man, because these things were used absolutely all over the countryside. It's one of the great changes that you don't nowadays see them everywhere. But their main job, of course, was, apart from blocking gaps in hedges, their main job was to contain the sheep in their pens, in hurdles, in the winter when they were on the root crops. The root crops were the break in the rotation that kept the land fertile, the thin chalk land, particularly where the sheep runs were. And by the time you've grown corn 2 years running on that sort of land, the land needed a rest and a resuscitation, and so they put the sheep out on it on turnips. And every day the shepherd went out with his bar and his maul to shift the pens of hurdles across the crop, so that gradually the sheep moved away across the green crop, treading as they ate. This used to be called the golden hoof. The sheep's feet trod the thin soil into a decent consistency, and the sheep droppings enriched it long before the days of imported nitrogen, and they were pressed into it by the golden hoof. And at the beginning of the season of the sheep penning, you would see a horse wagon going up the hill to the tops, absolutely loaded with hundreds of these for the use of the shepherd during the coming season. You can watch perfectly how he does this, mortising each of the holes in. The other interesting role of the hurdle in the countryside was when somebody fell off his horse in a hunting field and broke a leg or suffered any other sort of accident. People would take a look at him, realize he was fairly badly hurt, and somebody would shout, "Pull up a hurdle." And there was always a hurdle to be pulled up within sight, and that's what they carried him out on, because the hurdle, in fact, was the countryside stretcher. And there's no doubt at all that in the days of the Civil War, when the cavalry of the two sides were fighting one another all over the countryside, at the end of the day, when casualties had to be gathered in, they would be gathered in on hurdles. In earlier days, all these bits here would be put together by drilling with the brace and then, or with an auger in those days, and then putting in wooden pegs, ash pegs, that he would simply cut out with the bill for the purpose. Nowadays he allows himself the luxury of using galvanized nails. Nice to see the way he puts that little bit of ash bar in between the jig and the hurdle he's making in order to take the bang of a hammer. And now diagonal braces. The effect of building them this way, an experienced man building on a jig by which he governs every later one he makes, means that they were all absolutely remarkably similar in size. And you could put together your sheep pens terribly neatly. They used them, of course, in the markets in the old days, when the markets were held in the market squares and not in separate cattle markets as they now are. There would be piles of these stored behind the market hall, and in the morning the men would come out and they'd set these up in the market square, and they would contain the animals for the course of market day. Now all you've got to do is trim the ends. I don't believe I've actually seen one of these made since before the war. It's a pleasure to see that it still can be done. And there you are, the famous ash bar sheep hurdle made in the copses, once universal in the countryside, and now very difficult to find. The interesting thing about that is the reason why he's the son and the grandson of a woodman, and the reason why he's kept that skill is that he also makes the hurdles for the race courses. They're made on a similar sort of principle, though they're different size, and they're bigger, of course, because they go in the ground, they lean down there, and we have the brushwood behind them. But that's why he can still make an ash hurdle. And that froe that he was using, that tool, was actually not the real thing. It's so sad that these tools have gone into collections and hanging on the walls of pubs, so that when a skilled man like that actually needs one of them, it's almost impossible to get hold of the real thing. So what he had done with that froe we watched him using there was to take a piece of a car spring with the ring on the end, which goes into the shackle, and cut it off, and then he could put the handle in the ring at the end. He managed to make himself a fairish shrow, but I'm glad to say I've got him a real one. Rather short handle. I expect he'll put a longer handle on, but there it is, the real thing. And I've even made him the ash mallet with which you work it. So that's nice to see that go back into work again. And I brought home the ash hurdle he made because I thought that one day they might like to carry me off on it.